things as we're waiting on the last couple of people to get in. We have an online survey, and I know some of you have already taken the survey. It's like a Google form. If you haven't gotten that email, or if you tried to do it and it didn't make sense and it sent you somewhere weird or whatever, there are some paper copies if you'd like to take one. It's our first time to try to do something like this at St. Lawrence, a Bible study like in this particular format. So we're just trying to get some feedback on what did we do well, what did we not do well, before we plan in depth on another one, and before we go down the exact same path that we went down. We want to kind of see what the scenery is around us, and you guys can help describe that to us via the survey. So we put this survey together. Again, if you've already taken it, thank you. If you'd like to take one, you can take one with you, or you grab one now, or you do whatever it is you'd like to do. Again, I want to express my gratitude for all the leaders of this study. We've been led by some absolutely wonderful folks, and just want to recognize some of them that are in the room real quick. First of all, I want to recognize Joe Hodges, who led the youth study. I was sitting here sort of eavesdropping on Joe's leadership tonight, and this was the first night I'd gotten a chance to do that in all of these sessions, because most of the time they're across the way. But it was outstanding, and the quality of discussion from the youth was really outstanding. So give thanks to God that another generation of young people is being raised up in our church. It's a wonderful thing, and Joe obviously has knocked it out of the park again, so thank you, Joe. I want to thank Greg Jones for his leadership. Greg has been a great leader, and he was one of the people who was like, hey, we need to do this. And as we started planning for it, so grateful to Greg for his leadership. Sue has been out most of the spring, but Sue was also involved in the very early stages of getting this thing off, and then she's been needed out in California with her family out there. So I'm thankful to Sue. Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Greg, for your dedication to it, and it's meant the world. In Sue's absence this spring, Carrie Edson has pinch hit for Sue many times, so I want to say thanks to Carrie. She's back there behind the camera, and Ellie as well for pinch hitting several times too.
Rodney has pinch hit for me too.
And Rodney Matheny, right? So it takes a family to get these things done. And recognize Mark Mecca as well in the back there. Hillary Hale has been one of our leaders. She's at a banquet with Alfred tonight, so she's not here, but we're grateful to her. And Lisa Lepiska is up in Wisconsin visiting her son, so she's also not with us tonight. But so, this is a team thing. I want to say big thanks to Father Cooper for all of his good work. He's not here right at the moment, but it's been a big team thing. Angela Frazier also helped with the youth, so it's been a wonderful effort. Thank you guys for sticking with it to the bitter end. Next year, here's what we're going to do, and you'll hear a lot more about it. But what we're going to try to do is do 2 different sessions of Bible study next year. In the fall, we're going to do Ephesians, and we're still sort of discerning about what we're going to do in the spring. Ephesians is going to be 11-week study in the fall. N.T. Wright, who is the retired Bishop of Durham in England and one of the world's sort of leading Bible scholars, has a series of Bible studies that he's written, and it's called Ephesians for Everyone, and I have the book, and there's a Bible study guide that he's written, so you're not going to get original content from 2 bozos who work at St. Lawrence. You're going to get original content from somebody who's recognized as one of the world's leading Bible scholars, so we're going to be in good hands. I have the book, and I've read through it, and it's brilliant stuff. I think he makes very complicated presentations come across very simply. So it's a wonderful study. We'll use that as our platform. Again, the guy's name is N.T. Wright, if you haven't heard from him or heard of him. So that'll be kind of our platform in the fall. We'll be looking at Ephesians over 11 weeks, maybe 10, in the fall. But until then, we're on break, and we can get recharged. We'll be done before Thanksgiving is the hope in the fall, and then we'll have a long break between Thanksgiving and New Year's, and we'll figure out what to do in 2020. So stay tuned for more information. Absolutely keep Bible study going. This has been a wonderful effort. I've been blessed by it. Lots of things that I've gotten a chance to take an in-depth look at in St. John's Gospel. I hope it's blessed you and sort of opened your eyes to some of the ways that Jesus continues to be present with us in the church, and his ministry continues to come to us. Tonight, you guys have been talking about the epilogue, and I just want to kind of help put the cherry on top in terms of the discussion that you guys have been having and the study that you guys have undergone over the last week. And I think this worked out so perfectly with us talking about the resurrection and the resurrection appearances here during the Easter season. So we start tonight, of course, with the epilogue. The epilogue is sort of a curious thing with a lot of biblical scholars. There's a lot of disagreement over what it is, because John's Gospel seems to end at the end of John 20. He gives a concluding couple verses there at the end of chapter 20 that really kind of lead us to believe, and we read this in church just last Sunday, but it really, 2 Sundays ago, sorry, but it really kind of leads us to believe that he's wrapping it up, and it's kind of like he's landing the airplane and then he takes right back off again for one more tour around the ministry of Jesus. So at the end of chapter 20, here's what John writes. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. These are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. Of course, this is the sort of mission statement for the whole gospel. This is the summary of the whole gospel, all right? So there's lots of other things that Jesus did. They're not all in this book, but I wrote these down so that you guys would believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Some of the ancient manuscripts say that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and some say that through believing you may have life in his name. Okay, so we think maybe John was intending to end it right there. And scholars really debate what chapter 21 is. Possibly it's a later edition, like he writes it and he's like, sweet, that's a great gospel. And then he's like, well, there is just, Paul Harvey, the rest of the story, right? And maybe he decides he wants to write it. Maybe one of the other disciples. But the thing about chapter 21 that you need to know is it's in every single early manuscript that we have of John's Gospel. So we don't have, just as a word about manuscripts, we don't have the original manuscript of any of these books, right? So the actual piece of vellum that John wrote the original gospel on, or the papyrus, we don't have that, right? So we have a copy of it, and a lot of these copies are very early in the life of the church, but we don't have the original one for any of the biblical books. So what scholars do to give us the translations and to try to talk about the reliability of Scripture is they compare all of these different early manuscripts. And so if there are variants, is what it's called, but in this case, there is universal agreement that John 21 is part of the gospel. So typically it's described then as not necessarily an add-on, but an epilogue, sort of a last final word so that we can understand what's happening. Because there's a real transition that's happening between the ministry of Jesus in chapters 1 through 20. And in chapter 21, we see sort of the beginning of the apostolic ministry. How do I want to say that? So it's a little bit like Luke's gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. All right, so Luke writes both of them. Luke's gospel is part 1, and the Acts of the Apostles is part 2. This is what happens after Jesus ascends into heaven. And so what John's introducing us to is this concept of transition, that the ministry of Jesus is going to continue, but it's going to continue through the apostles, through the first apostles. And so what we're really reading about is the beginnings of the apostolic age, or the apostolic ministry of the church here in John chapter 21. Think about how difficult it would be if we didn't have chapter 21. The gospel would end with Peter not fully restored. The last thing we would have heard about Peter is he was out denying Jesus, and now we want him to be the leader of the early church. So it's an important thing that John does in chapter 21, because he tells us about this resurrection appearance, and he tells us about Peter's restoration, so that we'll know as we begin to read the Acts of the Apostles, okay, Peter was fully restored by the risen Lord before Jesus ascended into heaven. So there's no question marks sort of hanging out there about the authenticity of Peter's leadership in the life of the early church, because now we have chapter 21 to tell us about Jesus' restoration and commissioning of Peter. So this chapter plays a really, really important part as it ends the gospel. Everybody follow me on that? All right. You guys know the story. Peter's like, I'm going fishing. And we know that they take their cues from Peter already here in chapter 21. Peter's already become their leader, because they're like, okay, we will also come with you. We'll go fishing too. So we see here that they're taking their cues from Peter already. Remember in the New Testament, every time that the apostles are listed, St. Peter's always listed first. All right? In every single instance, Peter's name is always listed first. When the apostles are listed, they're listed all over the New Testament. Peter's always listed first. Judas is always listed last. This is not a coincidence, okay? So what we know is in the Acts of the Apostles, the first half is about St. Peter, and St. Peter really becomes the very clear leader of the early church, doing all these Christ-like things in the Acts of the Apostles. I mean, so much so that Peter's raising people from the dead. There's a part where people are bringing the sick out into the street, hoping that St. Peter's shadow will touch the sick, and that they'll be healed just by his shadow being cast on them. So when we read that, we're reading about, wow, that sounds like Jesus. There's only one other person in all of the New Testament that we read who sounds like that. So what we're reading is Peter sort of takes on this Christ-like role in the life of the early church. That's even more important to the importance of why chapter 21 of John's Gospel is so critical. Okay, so this special intimacy and special commissioning of Peter in chapter 21 becomes very, very important. Of course, Peter was a fisherman, and when we read that he says, like, I'm going fishing, what we're reading is, in a certain sense, he's saying, I'm going back to my old life. There's a certain symbolism in this. Because remember, they left everything. They literally dropped their nets and followed Jesus. And so they left behind an old life in order to follow the Lord, but now they're not quite sure. Or maybe they are sure and they're just having a little bit of doubt. It's open to interpretation, but it's symbolic that in some ways they're taking a step backwards, or at least a step to the side. And so the risen Lord appears on the seashore, there on the Sea of Galilee. And of course you know what happens, right? The abundance of the fish come into the boat. A couple of things on that. So where this takes place on the Sea of Galilee is really close to where Jesus multiplies the loaves and the fishes, all right? So this church, where it's called the Church of the Primacy, where Jesus and Peter and the other 6, there's 7 disciples that are there for this instance, for this appearance. It takes place just down the way from where Jesus has multiplied the loaves and fishes. So in both cases, we see at the hands of Jesus there is abundance, right? What we know about the appearance, though, here is the same thing that we can gather from Jesus talking with Mary Magdalene just a chapter earlier in the garden. There's something different about his appearance. And there's been a lot of theological speculation. Well, why can't they recognize the Lord? This is their best friend. But they've seen, and at first they're not quite sure who it is. And same thing, in the garden, as Jesus is risen from the dead, at first Mary Magdalene doesn't quite recognize him. It's only when he speaks her name that she recognizes him just a chapter before. Lots and lots of theological speculation about this. And where you end up is typically just that his appearance in the resurrection is somehow different. And we're not exactly sure in what way it's different. But what we know is that Jesus, it takes some sort of discernment to see the risen Lord acting. So sometimes John, in this moment, so you remember John recognizes him first, and then Peter's like, wait, it's the Lord, and he jumps out of the boat, very Peter style, like, oh, Jesus, I'm going to come to you. So John recognizes him. So sometimes what we read into this is that to recognize the risen Lord, it takes discernment. And it's true for Mary Magdalene. It's true for the 7 disciples who are in the boat here at the Sea of Galilee, and it's true for every person who's ever followed the risen Lord. Sometimes to see Jesus is very clear and it's very obvious, and other times it takes a whole lot of discernment to recognize the risen Lord, even and maybe especially under difficult circumstances. Remember, they've been fishing all night and have nothing to show for it, right? So they're in difficulty. They want to see the risen Lord, no doubt. They're eager to see him, and yet it's difficult to do. You guys have seen the thing about 153 fish. St. Jerome writes that at that time, the sort of Greek biologists, oceanographers thought that there were 153 species of fish in the world. Of course, now we know that there are like 33,000 species of fish in the world today. So they might have been just a little bit off, and I'm quite sure that they'll find more and more and more. But this number, 153, is usually seen as symbolic, as representing, all of the species of fish represent all the nations of the earth that will be drawn in through the catch of these apostles. So their mission is to all, is sort of the typical interpretation. Fun story on that, and I think Brother Morasic, who's sitting right there, pointed this out to me, but I could be wrong. When we did our capital campaign a couple years ago, and we were kicking this off, and I was talking one Sunday in church, we had this specific reading, and at that time, 153 parishioners had signed up for some part in the capital campaign, if you guys remember that. And so I said that day that the 153 number, I think Mike had spreadsheeted that one out for me. Spreadsheet Mike came through, and so I was able to sort of say, hey, there's 153, which represents all of us, right? All of us pulling together. So it's wonderful symbolism that John highlights here of again, this is a reflection on the apostolic ministry that's happening here in chapter 21, and their ministry will be to all people. They will go, as Jesus says, to the ends, to all the nations. And in Acts chapter 1, we'll read to the ends of the earth. They recognize Jesus, they're super happy to see him, and then they cook up some breakfast and eat it. We see Jesus, the risen Jesus, eat a couple of times. He eats some fish, they want us to know. The gospel writers are very exact about this point. There are some people in the early life of the church, and probably some people today, who say things like, well, Jesus wasn't really risen. I mean, that was sort of like a thought or an idea, or he's sort of risen, he appeared to be risen, but he's not, this isn't like really a thing. But part of the reason the gospel writers go out of their way to tell us that he ate some fish is like, no, this is like the body the bodily resurrection. This is not like the hologram Jesus, on the seashore or whatever. This is the risen Lord. And he really is sitting there cooking up some breakfast and eating it with his friends. All right, so ghosts don't eat breakfast.
Holy life.
This is the statue that is here at this place. It's a beautiful spot on the Sea of Galilee. And I remember there was a group of German Christians who were there, and they were singing a hymn right by this statue, like just sent chills down my spine, the sort of act of love and adoration I was watching when I was there. But it's beautiful right here, and this of course is the risen Lord, and this of course is St. Peter getting restored. It's a beautiful, beautiful statue. You'll remember, of course, just a couple chapters before, Peter, and you guys I'm sure picked up on this, he's got the charcoal fire, he's got his Kingsford going, and he's denied Jesus a couple times, and here by the charcoal fire, while they're cooking up a little fish, he gets restored 3 times. 3 times, do you love me? Simon, son of John, do you love me? Jesus says to him. And then, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, yes, Lord, you know I love you. Feed my sheep, tend my lambs, feed my sheep. So he's commissioning him, right? So the good shepherd is Jesus. We've heard that. That's John chapter 10. I am the good shepherd. And now he's telling St. Peter, you will be the one who will feed my sheep. Okay? And we're seeing here, Peter's no longer a fisherman, but a shepherd. And that's an important transition. Okay? So Peter's leaving behind. Now he's gone, thinking about going back to being a fisherman. Jesus already called him out of that. But now he is the shepherd who set over the flock. And we know Peter gets it because in 1 Peter chapter 5, when Peter exhorts the elders, the presbyters, the leaders of the early church, he tells them, tend the flock. So what Jesus said to him, he now writes in 1 Peter to the others who care for the flock. Sometimes you'll hear sermons, so those 2 words at the bottom, agape and phileo, are 2 different words for love in Greek. And sometimes you'll hear sermons about Jesus asks him, Simon, do you agape me? Do you love me? And sometimes you'll hear him say some sermons that want to, I think, probably overinterpret this because these are 2 different types of love. This is sort of seen as typically like an unconditional love, and this is sort of seen as more like a brotherly love. So Jesus says to him, do you agape me? And Peter says, well, I philios you. I love you as a brother. And Jesus is saying, do you unconditionally love me? And he's saying, I love you as a brother. And there's maybe you've heard sermons about this before. But what we want to know is that John uses those 2 words interchangeably throughout almost all the passages of his gospel. So I just put that up there in case you've heard sermons about that before, sort of maybe reading more into this than it really is. I think what's happening is he's asking, are you sure you love me? Because what follows is there's going to be a consequence to that love. All right? So are you sure you love me? Are you really sure you want to love me? Because you're going to have to do what the good shepherd does, and the good shepherd gives up his life for the sheep. Okay? So I think that's what's happening. And if you're confused by that last little bullet point there, then just leave it behind and don't worry about it. As you can with everything. Right.
I want to be on the test.
That's right. At the final judgment day, you ain't gonna see. They're gonna send me to the wrong place real quick, and you guys are gonna be there like, geez. Okay. The last word here that he says to Peter, and this is where I'm going with this. Of course, this is an ancient image of Peter crucified upside down. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wish. But when you grow old, you'll stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. And I think what he's telling Peter is, if you really love me and you're really going to tend my flock, then you're not your own man anymore. All right? You're taking on a new work. And People are going to lead you sometimes to places you do not want to go. And ultimately, he's saying you're not going to be your own man. And then John tells us, he gives away the meaning of this. He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God, right? So John is telling us, Jesus says this to Peter, ultimately revealing, Peter, you're going to be taken to a place you do not want to go, but this is going to be the consequence of being committed to me, and committed to the flock. And of course, we believe through tradition, the scriptures don't tell us this, but it's typically sort of agreed that Peter is martyred in Rome during the persecution of Nero, and typically most of the ancient, the church's art depicts it as an upside-down crucifixion. The legend, whether you accept it or not, is, Peter said he wasn't worthy to die of the same death that his Lord died. The gospel has a conclusion. It's an important conclusion, so I don't want to miss this. It's pretty subtle, but I don't want to miss it. It's probably the last word of John. It's probably the last word of John. All right? But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So John is saying, I didn't, and remember in John chapter 20, he says the same thing, didn't tell you everything. All right? There's lots more information out there. Now he told us in chapter 20, and this is where I started this lecture 20 minutes ago, these were the things I picked out so that you would believe that Jesus is the Messiah. But there's all kinds of other things out there. And this is typically where we get this concept of tradition from, all right? The apostolic tradition, which forms a part, such an important part of the apostolic ministry. So they're going to tell us the essential things that Jesus told them. And they're going to write down the essential things that Jesus told them. And that's going to be handed on to every generation of the church. But they're telling us there is other stuff. There's other stuff that Jesus had to say that we did not write down. And so this is where this concept of tradition and the early church's practice and the ordering of the early church's life helps us to understand the Gospels in context, all right? So again, this chapter is very much about the apostolic ministry of the church, that Jesus is getting ready to ascend into heaven. He's appointed as apostles to be the leaders of the church, and they're going to start teaching, and they're going to tell us all of the things that Jesus had to say. So in our church, of course, we have this concept of authority, and in the Anglican tradition, the way that we talk about authority is first Scripture. We have the written teachings of Christ, and then we talk about tradition, and then we talk about reason. And that's by this guy named Richard Hooker, who is one of the kind of important Anglican theologians. So there are lots of other things that Jesus did. So when you talk about tradition, of course we talk about tradition a lot around here. It's on the sign. It's one of those words. What we're saying is that we will continue in the apostles' teaching and fellowship and the breaking of bread and the prayers, those things which were markers of the early church and the life of the early church that will enrich and put our understanding of the Gospels in context. So you don't think this is kind of a throwaway thing. I think he's saying the apostolic teaching is important, and it will form the basis of authority in the life of the early church. And we know that there are other things, right? So we have other books in the New Testament that are the testimony of the first apostles. Peter among them, and John among them, that are outside of the Gospels. So this additional source of authority, again, sort of enriches our understanding of what Jesus did and what it means in the life of the church. So that's the last word of John. That's the last word I've got for you. Again, thank you for sticking with this Bible study since September. It's May, man. But we appreciate you so much. I hope your understanding of John's Gospel has been enriched. And we'll have something to look forward to in September when we start talking about Ephesians.
Thank you.
On stand, and we'll say a prayer. And again, we do have a little notes, so if you were confused by something I said, there are notes. There are a few little reflection questions on the entire class, too. So on the entire series, if you want to do some homework. I know you guys love homework. And then there are written surveys here as well. If you'd like to take one of those, or if you want to do the online one, Google will compile it for us, which would be great. So either way, thank you again. Let us pray. Father, thank you so much for all that you've done for us. And thank you for calling us to be a part of this community and this study of St. John's Gospel, for enriching our understanding of faith and enriching our understanding of all that you have done for us. Send us forth with your blessing. Bless our lives. Bless our families. Help us always to grow in faith and hope and love. In Jesus' holy name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Father.
Thank you, Greg, for all your work in it.